Wow.
This is where the magic happens.
They don't know. They're not business major. They're not accountant. So you can
English, please.
So who took chemistry for electives and stuff like that? The chemistry
Heather.
100.
That's like IPChem.
All right. Well, what we're basically doing is, let's see, starting from the tree, all right? So basically, you're used to seeing, I guess, paper. Paper is made out of the cell wall of a tree. So when a tree grows, they have these, I guess, little nodes where they make the polymer that we use in paper, which is cellulose. So it spits out these little cellulose chains. They tend to come in clusters. So you have a cluster of cellulose chains coming out. And as it comes out, they kind of together start to crystallize with one another and form what's called a nanofibril. And then there's multiple nanofibrils that kind of graft with each other, making what's called a microfibril. And then these microfibrils graft with each other and they form different layers of the cell wall. So the cell wall kind of is similar to like a steel cable in that there's kind of different cables that are kind of wrapped with one another and make up the wall. And they rotate at different angles and different layers, and that kind of what gives a tree kind of some of its base strength. So in making cellulose, these cellulose nanomaterials we're essentially trying to tear apart all of that structure back to essentially the nanofibril that is kind of the bundle of the initial cellulose chain. We're trying to make two products here. One is called cellulose nanofibrils, in which case we try to keep that fibril kind of intact, so it's basically a long, very, very tiny fiber. The other one is cellulose nanocrystals, and that's taking that long fiber, but we're basically chopping it up. We're getting rid of all the little amorphous material, which is kind of the weakest parts of that fibril, and just isolating the crystalline pieces, which is kind of the strongest, stiffest part of that material. And there are kind of benefits and differences to the two, but that's essentially, we're trying to tear down the structure of the fiber kind of down to that base structure, not all the way down to the cellulose chains, to the kind of the cellulose polymer, but just the first kind of structure where they come together.
That's far enough to get what you need then?
Well, the chemistry of individual cellulose polymers and chains has been around for 50 or 100 years. People have been playing with that. But the kind of the next step up, kind of the step between individual chains, like working with an individual polymer molecules versus the cell structure, which is used for paper and cardboard and all that. This is kind of taking that smallest structural level that the plants and trees use for essentially growing different plants and trees.
This is like how long of a refining process is this to get to that point from the start?
Well, that kind of depends on what you're going after.
Okay.
There's kind of 3 cellulose nanoproducts. We're making 2 of them here, and the third one is being made at the University of Maine. The first one we're making here is the cellulose nanocrystals. So we're just trying to isolate these little stiff crystalline rods. So what we do there is we digest in 64% sulfuric acid. This does 2 things. It hydrolyzes the amorphous material, so it basically breaks the cellulose down in these little crystalline domains. The second thing it does, which we use for isolation and purifying, is it adds little sulfate groups to the surface of the crystallite. What this does is that little charge makes it colloidal. Basically, it disperses it in water, basically for infinite time. It's kind of like when you homogenize milk. Milk fats have a little negative charge on it, carboxylate groups and stuff. If you get enough of these charges in a small enough fat particle, the milk fat stays dispersed forever. But the same thing with the nanocrystals, we have these little charges on it. You get enough charges on a small enough particle, and it will stay dispersed. That's what a colloid is.
Permanently?
Permanently.
Wow.
And so what we do is we hydrolyze and add the sulfate groups in the reaction. So it's pretty concentrated acid. This is the kind of stuff you can dissolve away anything with. So this is life. You don't want anything splashed on you.
It's a dangerous job, though.
Yeah.
that's dangerous.
And all these reactors here are all glass-lined steel.
Oh. Yeah, I'm good. Can I'm dizzy holding this and trying to
I know.
balance myself.
Technically, we could have gone with a plastic like CPVC, but heat transfer is bad, and you know, from a business standpoint, what we're doing here at the Forest Products Lab is we're kind of supplying research for the rest of the country, and I've been sending stuff around the world, so people can figure out what to do with it. And once it starts going into a commercial product, the Forest Products Lab, as a government agency, can no longer make it. We can't compete with the private industry, but we can supply industry with R&D materials for them to figure out what to do with it.
Right.
Okay, so you guys are mainly doing the research, you're doing the testing, and seeing what can happen. From there, you're sending it off to somebody else, kind of.
From this mill, yeah, we're kind of, well, the chemistry for this stuff has been around for a while. The nanocrystals have been around for about 50 or 60 years. The nanofibrils for about 15, 20, depending on which kind you're making stuff on. So from this plant standpoint, there's not that much R&D. It's more of making an R&D product to give to other people. There's a little bit of trying to figure out how to scale up and how to process this stuff on larger scales, because all the people that did R&D were working in little beakers, that kind of stuff. And, but what we're trying to do is essentially make enough material for other people to do other research on. So the other, then there's a bunch of steps that I won't go into details of purifying it and concentrating it. We're essentially selling it as an aqueous concentrated suspension, so it's thick, viscous material. It's almost like a syrup, kind of gelatinous, probably between Jello and syrup. And, but we're also freeze drying it so people can work with it as a solid powder.
Does it change any of the properties at all? Or?
Well, the trick in some of the work people are trying to do it, like one of the uses that people are trying to look at a lot is putting it as a reinforcement in plastics. Trying to essentially upgrade cheaper plastics or use bio-based plastics that are stronger and things like that. And this stuff is colloidal in water, so it's hydrophilic. It loves water. Whereas most of the polymers are working with hydrophobic and they hate water, and the trick is trying to keep the dispersion of the nanocrystals in the plastic as they're extruding it. And that's where the trick comes in. So people are doing a few different things.
What would happen if it was in water? I mean,
When it's in water, at least when it's dilute in water, the individual crystallites, because they're all negatively charged, they all try to get as far away from each other as possible. That's why it's a stable colloidal suspension for infinite time. Because with the charge, everything is negative, so they're all repelling each other.
okay.
So they want to stay away from as far from each other as possible. But the problem is that's what happens in water. But you try to go to another, like an organic solvent, the nanocrystals don't like the organic solvent, so they kind of prefer to come together with each other. And so the trick is trying, so the trick is trying to get it from aqueous phase, which we manufactured, into a plastic phase. And there are a few water, kind of the best success they've had is some of the water-soluble polymers, things like that. But, nanocrystals stay colloidal, the polymers are dissolved in it, you can cast it or do things differently. But there's not a lot of water-based polymers that people want to work with, so people want to work with other polymers because they're more prevalent and cheaper, stronger, better characterized, all that kind of stuff.
Does it always come down to price 99% of the time? Or
Yeah, but
not necessarily.
yeah, but that's going to vary too depending on use, because if it goes into an iPhone, which has a high end market value, versus a panel on a car, there's radically different price considerations. And both of those things are things people are looking at. People are looking at it for lighter weight cars and things like that.
So that has a very large market potential then, you're saying? Probably like vehicle and...
It has a huge potential market thing. It's just a matter of everyone has to figure out how to use it and utilize it. For example, let's see, I sent stuff to the Army. The Army is doing research on bulletproof glass. One of the things that cellulose has over carbon nanotubes, over Kevlar, we can actually make clear plastic composites. And Kevlar and carbon nanotubes and that kind of stuff, you can't make clear composites. They're all opaque, you can't see through them. So that's one advantage that nanocellulose has. And so the Army is looking at kind of lighter weight bulletproof glass for like for vehicles, but also for body armor, body shields, and things like that. There's also one of the interesting things about the nanocrystals, because it is individual rods and colloidal. If you start concentrating them, they want to align with each other, kind of like a liquid crystal. And when you do that, because of their size, they can bend and refract light in different ways. And so you can actually play with colors. If you cast some films, you can get like mother of pearlescence to them. And so there's a couple companies looking at security papers, like coatings on certificates,
Sure.
dollar bills, that kind of stuff.
Currency, yeah.
Let's see, what else? People are looking at it for kind of, one of the people here at UW is looking at when you make a silicon chip, 95% of the silicon wafer is used only for the structure of the silicon chip itself. It's not used in actual interactions of the chip. And so what they did was they kind of they cast the film of the nanocrystals, kind of the base structure, put a thinner layer of silicon on it, and then essentially did a little circuit on top of that. So the idea is that on things like we're throwing away too many cell phones and electronics, and it's to save money on the silicon, it's also to make the components of the phone a little bit more biocompatible. So there's less of the silicon and less of this other stuff going into landfills and things like that. And then there are other medical application researches that people have been doing. They've been using bacterial cellulose for severe burn victims. It's compatible with covering things so your skin grows back, and there's some other things. There was a paper I saw where they used nanocellulose, that thick viscous gel, to kind of coat a scaffold, and then they grew a culture of skin cells on it. So they essentially grew an artificial ear using the nanocrystals as kind of a structural intermediate medium for some of that stuff. Wow. There's tons of possible things. It's just a matter of someone trying to figure out something that's actually usable in the end, and can kind of fits with prices and cost effective and all that sort of stuff.
Did you ever imagine any of those markets when you're developing this, or either one of you, or?
Yeah, like the composites one has been obvious. People have been kind of tinkering with that for years.
Okay.
I guess the medical one, people, like I said, have played with bacterial cellulose and stuff for kind of burn bandages for a long time.
What's the big difference between like bacterial cellulose versus like what you do from the wood fibers?
The bacterial cellulose is, I guess I would say it's slightly larger, because you've brought together more chains and the chains have started to wrap. I mean, you could use bacterial cellulose as a feedstock for this, and it may come apart a little bit faster and more easily,
Okay.
less refining energy. Then, of course, the idea would be, how do you grow bacterial cellulose on a massive scale? That
Right.
depends on what your market is and how big it is. Whereas tree growth, we're already growing trees on a massive, massive scale, and so that's an obvious cellulose source of cotton. So the bacterial cellulose has a large-scale feedstock. I don't know if that's possible.
Okay. So it's not quite as advanced, not quite as durable. Longevity-wise, you're probably better off doing it this way.
Yeah, I would say it's mostly about capacity. Bacterial cellulose grows very slowly. You need to take,
Right.
you need to have digesters, fermenters that would essentially